Okay, we are recording. So, hello and welcome to question and answer number 117. I am your host, pannobhasa. And those of you who watched the previous Q&A may recall that I mentioned that I was in a somewhat agitated mental state because of the situation at work, which might result in my being fired. And I'm in not really much of a better mood this weekend because on Tuesday it actually happened. So I am no longer working at a sheet metal shop. And at first, like last weekend, I didn't want to give any details because I was still working for the place and everything. But what happened was upper management for several months has had this policy of not hiring anybody at our shop, not even to replace people who had left. And it took 8 or 9 people to run the shop efficiently and effectively. You know, we had 8 at the beginning of the year, and still we could have used an extra guy just to make sure everything gets done in a timely manner. And people just started quitting, and upper management just saw no reason to replace them. So the other warehouse guy quit, so I was the only full-time machine operator in the shop. Then the office manager quit. Then one of the 2 sales reps quit. And then a little over 2 months ago, maybe 2.5 months ago, the branch manager quit. And we went for more than 2 months without even a manager there. And we were just swamped. We could not keep up with customer orders. We're getting farther and farther behind. The sales rep is saying, well, maybe in a week or so we can get your order, when it's supposed to be like the next day. And we were just so completely swamped with too few people that every few weeks I would send an email, an increasingly frustrated, acerbic kind of email to upper management telling them that we are losing customers, we are losing business, we are losing money because of managerial incompetence. And the last one I sent, which was this previous Monday morning, I just flat out accused them of being incompetent. And the camel's back was just broken at that point. I didn't give a damn anymore. And I just told them, I may lose my job because of this. But if I do, then the total number of full-time warehouse staff, like machine operators, will be 0. And then you're finally, at long last, going to have to do something about this situation. So I sent the email to the regional manager, the head of HR in this, responsible for that area, the regional manager's boss, the regional manager's boss's boss, and the CEO of the entire corporation. And all I got back that day was this bland email from the regional manager thanking me for expressing my concerns. But then the next day after that, Tuesday, we were completely swamped as usual. I get called into the manager's office, which is usually locked because there's no manager. And there was like this conference call with the regional manager, the HR guy, and some lady that I'd never seen before. And they're saying, well, you're just going to have to do it. And it was just completely unrealistic. What they're telling me to do, what completely precipitated this was, as I was saying, we were completely swamped. We could not keep up. And then some regional sales guy sent us this order to produce that was just so unrealistic. It was 20-foot long trim, very complicated. It would take 2 guys forever to make this stuff. We only really had 1 guy anyway. So I sent this email in the email that was accusing the upper management of being incompetent with regard to just losing customers, losing business, losing money due to their own policy of refusing to hire anybody. That I said, if this order is going to get done, somebody else is going to have to do it, or you could reduce the length of it so that only 1 guy can make it because I'm only 1 guy, or you can have the sales guy who, like the regional sales guy, help me make it. And he can expect to help me make all this other long, complicated stuff that he sends me until we get more guys. And so the regional manager on this conference call said, well, he hasn't had the necessary safety training to help you on that machine, but nobody in the shop had that safety training. So he's just bullshitting me. And probably my theory is that he just resented being called out for being incompetent. He wanted to do some kind of dominance move and put me in my place or some such. And so he's just saying, you're going to have to do it. And so I just said no. And so I got fired. So I'm looking for another job. Maybe I'll get a job at the zoo. That would be kind of nice. And so that's the big news. And I have to admit, I've been in kind of not a very chill, relaxed kind of mood lately, as you may have already noticed. I guess the other big news is I got 2 more loaches for my aquarium, and they just wiped out all the snails except for some they're called nerite snails because they stay completely underneath their shell, whereas any kind of snail that like sticks feelers out or anything out of its shell, the loaches get it. Also, my lovely sweetheart, she got a little Siamese fighting fish tank. She was going to have a male and a female in the same tank. Didn't work. The male was just like beating the shit out of the female. And so we've got like this little, you see like a little blue fluttery kind of fish back there. That's the female Siamese fighting fish who is a refugee now in my tank because of an abusive partner. So I think we're all caught up. And I guess I'll just commence to answering questions because that's why I'm here. I still have this job of answering questions. And there is a good chance I'll put out a few more short videos than I usually do. And by short, I mean less than 2 hours. Preferably less than half an hour. Just because this is like the only job I've got right now other than just looking for another job, which does take some time and effort, especially when you're trying to do stuff online. You got to jump through so many hoops. You know, it's like you're having to verify security codes and all this. Like they're just going to send it to your phone, and you have to log in and come up with a new password and everything just to like apply for a job. So anyways, the first question is from Virgil. And Virgil is asking about Mogok Sayadaw of Burma. And he says, Mogok Sayadaw, did you attend a retreat in his tradition of Vipassana, or do you know anyone in Burma who did? If so, what's your opinion about the system? I heard his Vipassana is very popular in Burma. And it is true that when I was living in northwestern Burma, which is the part of Burma I probably spent the most time in, there was a lot of people following the Mogok method. There were a lot of people following Mogok, even more people following the Ledi method, Ledi Sayadaw method, and also there was some The Ingu method. Those were like the 3 main methods in that area, plus probably Mahasi, because Mahasi's everywhere in Burma. So anyways, Mogok Sayadaw's method, it has a lot of emphasis on understanding Paticca in accordance with the traditional dogmatic 12-link theory of dependent co-arising. And if you don't know what that is, that's fine. You might actually be better off not knowing what that is. So I never really attended a retreat in the Mogok method. I never followed the Mogok method of meditation. But I did have a couple of monastery attendants who were really into the Mogok method. And just living in that part of Burma, I came across a lot of people who followed the Mogok method. And it really does rely heavily on understanding the 12 links of dependent co-arising as is expressed in the text and the commentaries. And it's almost like a symbol of the Mogok method that you've got the wheel of dependent co-arising with all these arrows and links and everything. And a lot of like the 2 monastery attendants that were staying at the monastery sometimes, they would meditate a lot of the time. They would just sit there cross-legged with their eyes closed, listening to a recording of either Mogok Sayadaw himself or a disciple of Mogok Sayadaw explaining dependent co-arising. And I think they use those those charts of the circular wheel of dependent core rising as a kind of like a mandala or something. And so for me, it just is way too much thinking about this dogmatic interpretation of dependent core rising. And just, I mean, what I heard about Mogok Sayadaw is that he was very wise. Some people thought he was fully enlightened, but still the method itself really did not appeal to me, just because I really don't have a whole lot of use for the 12 nidana theory of dependent core rising, and just all this thinking and listening to recordings while you're supposed to be meditating and so forth. It just didn't appeal to me. So my opinion of the Sayadaw himself would be higher than my opinion of the tradition that is associated with that Sayadaw, just because, I mean, for some people it might be really nice, and I never really did find out what any deeper level of meditation would be other than just like contemplating dependent core rising. I assume there would be some mindfulness involved, but mainly, you know, when you ask about Mogok method, they're going to tell you how it differs from other methods, and how it differs is this emphasis on understanding the 12 links of dependent core rising divided up into 3 lives, you know, the previous life, the present life, and the future life, and etc. and so on. So that would probably be the best I could answer that question without just rambling into complete digressions. So I'm just going to move on to Virgil's next question, which is also about Mogok Sayadaw. He says, after Mogok Sayadaw was cremated, apparently they found some sort of relics in his ash, including an eyeball, an intact tooth, and these pearly things that look like gemstones that said to appear only in the case of arahants. Do you know if there is any support in the suttas that link these relics to the achievement of arahantship, or is it purely Burmese folklore? Well, actually neither. It's not purely Burmese folklore, because I have read that in China, like back when China was still like openly Buddhist, at least a lot of China was openly Buddhist, they were finding these same relics. They're these little round balls that look kind of like pearls in the ashes of Mahayana Buddhist monks. And the Burmese, I mean, they would have to say, no, that's not possible, because the Burmese believe that if you find these little pearl-like things in the ashes after a monk is cremated, that is evidence that he was enlightened. So they don't believe that Mahayana monks can become enlightened, because they're staunch, devout Theravada Buddhists. And so they really don't know how to deal with that. I mean, there are Mahayana monks who also leave behind these balls. And there's no mention of it at all in the Pali texts. In fact, I have seen probably what are authentic relics of Gautama Buddha himself, and it's just charred little bits of bone. And I came across a theory, which might be accurate, that these little pearl-like balls are actually gallstones or kidney stones. So, yeah, but it's really a big deal in Burma. They're called datdo, which is usually, it's translated as relic, but literally means something like noble element. And I mean, there are like little museum, like little building. I mean, it's a small museum, just like one big room that's like connected with a big pagoda or some such. You can go in, and it's just all these datdos, all these little balls and little white shapes that are like in reliquaries, you know, they're like in little glass cases and so forth, and they'll point out this is from this arahant and this is from that arahant, and they almost always have some from the Buddha himself, which, you know, it's sort of like in medieval Europe, people selling fragments of like the jawbone of the donkey that Samson was killing Philistines with, or, you know, a piece of the true cross, or this kind of thing. You know, a piece of the crown of thorns that was crowned Jesus and all this. It's kind of the same thing, because there's no mention at all of these little pearl-like things that are found in the relics or in the ashes of the Buddha himself, or in anybody that you're going to find in the Pali text. At least I've never come across any mention of these little pearl-like balls being found in the ashes of a cremated arahant. But in Burma, and the only thing I ever heard about with regard to Mogok Sayadaw, what they found in his ashes, I've been told that both of his eyeballs were left unburned. And it could be that it was just like two of the larger pearl-like balls that maybe are like kidney stones or gallstones or something. I don't know. But if you saw pictures of Mogok Sayadaw, he had very like striking, penetrating eyes, kind of like Osho or the Bhagwan Rajneesh. How I mean, I'm not comparing them personality-wise or attainment-wise, but both of them had like these like penetrating eyes, like these large, dark, kind of luminous-looking eyes. And so it may be that because he really did have striking eyeballs in life, that when they found some balls in the ashes, they just assumed that they were his eyeballs. So, yeah, the intact tooth, I never heard about the whole time I was in Burma. I was living in Mogok country and never heard of that. And then the pearly things, which, it's mainly just a tradition, but it's not purely a Burmese tradition because it also existed in China in days gone by before China turned communist. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, don't you sometimes miss your monk's life? And really the correct answer, the true answer to that is no, I don't really miss the monk's life. It was just obviously very important part of my life, this important stage, like half my life, I was a monk. It's just kind of amazing to me that really it was like I spent so long as a monk. It doesn't really seem like I was a monk for 30 years, but I was. But I mean, I've really taken to heart the idea of, wherever you are, I mean, that's just where you are, and you just continue, moving forwards and regretting or wishing things had been different in the past. I mean, everyone can fall prey to that. Even I am like over the past few days, past 4 days, just kind of replaying just the whole fiasco at work in my mind and thinking, I should have said this. This would have been more, I would have been fired regardless, but at least I could have like stated my case better. But really, I was so angry at the time that, the camel's back was already broken and it was a hopeless case. So anyways, after that digression, I don't really miss the monk's life. I'm glad that I was a monk. It's been just a formative, period of my life, definitely. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys right now if I hadn't become a monk. But, I stopped being a monk just because it wasn't working anymore. I've already gone over all the reasons and everything. It was like it had run its course. I had gotten as far as I could with it. It was time to move on to something else. It was fairly obvious at the time. So, no regrets, no real missing of it. And so, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Satipatthanas. And he says, you were talking about how breath meditation can involve many aspects of the four satipatthanas. It says explicitly in the various descriptions of the 16 steps to anapanasati that when followed properly, it satisfies all four satipatthanas. Can you please explain how this does that? What I mean is that I understand you have said that it isn't good meditation advice, but I don't even understand how you can possibly practice what is even said in these instructions, as the instructions seem so vague and random. And I really do not understand why Siovak and Satipatthanas is so fixated on these 16 steps of anapanasati, since both of us appear to be pretty much in agreement that it's not very good instruction. I doubt that the Buddha gave the instruction as it is found in the texts, that it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's all this thinking. You're supposed to be doing mindfulness of breathing, but there's all this thinking about what you're going to be doing in the future. I will be this in the future. I will do that. It's like, and all this discernment, all this discriminating perception that, I mean, it's not good meditation if you're doing that. Unless somehow there's some way of transcending the discriminating perception so that you can be kind of above and detached from the discriminating perception, maybe like purely mindful of discriminating perception, in which case you're not really dealing with the content of the perception anymore. So, and why he keeps, this is like his third question about these same 16 steps. And he says, can you please explain how the 16 steps, which I don't consider to be authentic teachings of the Buddha, probably, I can't just categorically insist that the Buddha really didn't teach it, but it may be like a garbled, distorted version of something that he taught, because to me, it just does not seem like good advice with regard to how to do mindfulness of breathing. And so, can I please explain how this satisfies all four satipatthanas? I mean, you'd have to look in the commentaries, I guess, and maybe you'll find an explanation of that. But I mean, it's all academic, because neither one of us really takes it very seriously, apparently. Although maybe Siobhakshan Sipadzirina takes it way more seriously than I do, because this is the third question he has asked about this. And it's all pretty much like flogging the same dead baby, because choking the same dead chicken, if you will, because it just strikes me as all academic. It's just some sort of commentarial explanation to make sense of things that isn't necessarily going to be an improvement on just not knowing. So, let's see. Yeah, I mean, you can work it out for yourself, because it just strikes me as being this academic question about the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing that I do not consider to be very good advice. It could be that I just not getting it somehow, but all this thought and like thinking about what you're going to cultivate in the future and all that, when you're supposed to be sitting there just being mindful of breathing, it just strikes me as some sort of scholastic, some ancient Buddhist scholastic got carried away, maybe just took the original teaching and just sort of elaborated on it in a way that kind of distorted it beyond all recognition. So yeah, there really, I don't know what the answer would be to that. I really have not had any real interest in it. I never really took, I mean, from the first time I read the Anapanasati Sutta, that, I mean, it just did not strike a chord with me at all. It just kind of just landed with a thud when I read the thing. Never had much interest in it. Didn't bother reading the commentarial explanation of it. It just didn't work for me. I went with a different method. So, I mean, if it clicks with you, then yeah, go ahead and do it. And then maybe you'll find out from your own experience how all four of the foundations or applications of mindfulness are satisfied and perfected by following the 16 steps. But it's just not something that I'm really in a position to explain, because I never bothered to find out what the explanation is. It's sort of like reading Hegel or something, or reading like this complicated text on like an earth-centered astronomy. I've got a book back there, the Surya Siddhanta, that, I mean, I read the thing just as a matter of self-discipline, kind of. It's just, I don't like having a book and getting started on it and then not finishing it. But it was so hard to read this, and it's all based on a geocentric model of the universe, which, I mean, I just can't take it seriously. Anyway, why try to figure out how to, try to follow this and just, keep up with it, understand everything that's being said, when you don't really take it seriously to begin with. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit's another one. I read it, but at some point, you have to reach this point of it's just not worth the effort to bust my ass intellectually trying to understand everything that he's saying, when even the editor and translator of the book didn't fully understand it. And I'm pretty sure that Hegel really was just being a sophist when he was writing most of it anyway. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Siobhakshan Sipadzirina. And please, Siobhakshan Sipadzirina, no more questions about the 16 stages of anapanasati as found in these suttas. So, Sea of Action Sipadzina says, as you probably know, people care a lot about looks when they are young and start caring about other things when their looks start going to shit with age, as most don't age as well as you. When I try to overcome attachment to the body by thinking it will one day become old and ugly, I constantly think about how it was never even good looking to begin with anyways, so I'm just coping. Maybe there is a different way to deal with attachment to the body for people who never had any delusion of thinking their own body is attractive in the first place. Do you have any advice for people like this? Well, I'm kind of like that myself. I mean, when I was younger, I did not consider myself to be good looking. There were a few girls in school when I was younger that thought I was a cutie or something, thought I was, attractive. But mainly, I think I was attractive because of my personality and my intelligence and so forth, my sense of humor more than my appearance. I think I might have actually improved in looks since I was 20 years old. I never liked my nose. I just thought that I had like this little snub nose and it just was not attractive. And had kind of like a weak chin or something, which as I've gotten older, it's kind of filled out. It's like your features kind of continue to grow somewhat, or maybe there's like this old Talking Heads kind of spoken word song, on their album Remain in Light, talking about how a person, it's like their attitude determines their appearance. They can sort of gradually, subtly alter their appearance through, the ideals they have in their mind and so forth. Maybe that happened with me or something. I don't know. But I never really considered myself to be really good looking or even particularly tall, even though I'm well above 6 feet. Still, like if I try to imagine myself talking with other people, I'd always kind of imagine myself at about the same level as them. And so, I've never really been identified with my body all that much either. So, yeah, this might be a strike two in answering Sea of Action Sipad Zirna, because I've never really been that preoccupied with my looks. When I was young, like when I was in high school and college, I just had like long, straggly hair. It was all curly, and it didn't quite get into the dreadlocks. But I'd like comb it with my fingers, and all these weird booping sounds that you hear are my sweetheart's computer's notifications for Discord, I think. So, yeah, I never really was all that. I really didn't care all that much about my appearance. Never considered myself to be all that good looking, and furthermore, I was just so head oriented, just so introverted that I really just did not identify with my body all that much. And so, let's see. Maybe I should just get back to the question here. Let's see, where is it? When I try to overcome attachment to the body by thinking it will one day become old and ugly, I constantly think about how it was never even good looking to begin with anyway, so I'm just coping. Maybe there is a different way to deal with attachment to the body for people who never had any delusion of thinking their own body is attractive in the first place. Do you have any advice for people like this? Well, if you're doing Buddhist meditation on like the foulness of the body, like the 32 parts of the body meditation, or contemplation of corpses, for example, then, you're supposed to be considering that your body is foul now. No matter what you look like, it's like even the most beautiful woman in the world. I saw a few autopsies when I was in Burma, and I know that like the smooth, rounded, voluptuous curves of a beautiful woman, you get below the skin, and it looks like this partially melted Velveeta cheese, the subcutaneous adipose tissue. And then there's all the guts and stuff, it's snot and mucus and phlegm and all this kind of stuff is, even inside the most beautiful person. And you look at people on the internet or on TV nowadays, the most beautiful people, there's lots of plastic and stuff added to them anyway. They've got all these artificial padding and stuff added. And I think we're just going to be stuck with these Discord notices booping for I don't know how much longer. That was my Discord server there. So let's see here. A different way to deal with attachment to the body for people who never had any delusion of thinking their own body was attractive in the first place. Well, I mean, just contemplate the 32 parts of the body, for example. Do that meditation, and that works for anybody, regardless of what they look like. Because, once you get under the skin, I mean, it's all this goop, essentially. So maybe you could try that. But, I mean, I don't know. It's just, I can't really relate to it very much simply because I never really identified with my body, never really identified with my name either. It's just, I'm more mentally oriented, I guess. And they're just going for it big time on the Discord server right now. So I think I'm just going to, so I guess I should give like the definitive answer before moving on to the next one. Now, would traditionally, according to Theravada Buddhist tradition, the correct meditation to do, or the correct practice, if you want to reduce your attachment to your own body, is contemplate the foulness of your body now. Don't contemplate how foul it's going to be when you're 80. Just contemplate, all the goop and ick and just, I mean, I guess witnessing an autopsy might not be realistic, but maybe you could even find online somewhere like an autopsy video or something that would be the next best thing to actually watching a real autopsy. So yeah, the 32 parts of the body meditation is the standard meditation that is prescribed in Theravada Buddhism for overcoming attachment to the body. And so I'm just going to move on to Siovakshan Sipadzina's third question, which is, you have talked about half the sutta doctrines being added in the first 100 years, but this doesn't seem to make much sense to me. With your comparison to Jesus you have made before, he taught for like 1 to 3 years. All his disciples rejected him in the end, while the Buddha taught for 45 years, had many enlightened students, and Ananda lived for almost 40 years after the Buddha himself died. The Sutta teachings that are in common with all schools seem closer in comparison to the works of Plato or Aristotle really being their own. We don't have their writings directly and mostly have their teachings from Roman sources and vague references from later Greek sources. However, they were both famous enough that their teachings would have been preserved much better as a result. Sure, the Buddha didn't write anything himself, but it doesn't seem fair to compare it to the case of Christianity. Even in Christianity, Jesus' brother James seems to have run the sect of Ebionite Christians, which probably heavily reflected the historical Jesus' teachings well, but that church died out, so it seems even with 1 to 3 years of preaching, Jesus' true teachings lasted around over 400 years. So with all this in mind, even in the worst case scenario, it doesn't make much to say Christianity was ruined in the first 100 years. The original message was still out there, but it was just a minority school. So how can you claim Buddhism, with many more factors and circumstances to preserve their teachings, would end up having half the text common to all schools be added on later? And he's referring to statements I made in a previous video, like the video that I uploaded right before this one a few days ago, about like the history of the development of the Buddhist texts. And I was being generous when I said maybe half of the core texts represent authentic teaching of the Buddha. I think it might be closer to maybe 20 to 25%. Let's say 25%. So I mean, I'm doubling down literally on what I was saying in that previous video, that of the teachings as they existed, like the Dhamma or Dharma as it existed, the Sutta literature and the Vinaya, as it existed 100 years after the time of the Buddha, was maybe 25% authentic. But I mean, there's like a spectrum. On the one extreme, you've got literal verbatim records of what the Buddha actually said, just 100% quotes. And then you've got, after that would be like a paraphrase, you've got sort of as you move farther away, the paraphrase gets looser and looser, but still it would be along the lines of what he taught and something that he would be likely to endorse. And then you start getting into stuff that's largely irrelevant, this stuff that's just kind of made up and added, but is kind of, sort of along the lines of what he taught, even though, it's just made up in the kind of originated with somebody else in more or less of the spirit, even though the Buddha never really addressed the issue or some such, or never would address it in that manner or whatever. And then finally you get stuff at the other extreme that's just mythological stuff that the Buddha would just denounce, that he would just deny having anything to do with that. And some of the stuff that is in the Pali Tipitaka, including the core texts, would in all likelihood be something that the Buddha would just, no, I would never say such a thing. A lot of the miracle stuff, for example. So the Christians did have the advantage in that both the Jews and the Greeks, and it was like a Hellenized Judaism was sort of like the environment in which Christianity first arose. Both the Jews and the Greeks already had an objective sense of history and of accurate record keeping, which was not the case in India. I mean, it's still, in India in the Buddhist time, there was more of a surreal understanding of reality. There was less of an idea of objectivity. And it's still that way in large parts of Burma, where, just wild theories and just rumors and so forth can spread like wildfire and just totally distort, like something I said or did, would come back to me like 2 days later in this totally distorted form. So it is true that the Buddha apparently was much more successful as a teacher than Jesus was, although where he says here that, let's see, he said something like all of Jesus's disciples like rejected him. I don't know where you get the idea that all of Jesus's disciples rejected him in the end. According to tradition, all of his apostles were martyred for not rejecting him. It's true that St. Peter, kind of denied knowing him, and the cock crowed 3 times and so forth. But, it was written down earlier than Buddhism by hundreds of years. Hundreds of years after the time of the founder, and also the culture that it arose in was definitely more attuned to the whole idea of like accurate, objective record keeping. And even then, they just missed the boat. It's sort of like human beings are like we're the most rational animal, but still, we're a far cry from perfect at it. So he talks about James, who is considered to be the brother of Jesus. And James, he was the leader of the Christian church after Jesus died. He was in the lineage of King David and so forth, supposedly, presuming that they actually took that seriously, that Jesus was a descendant of King David, that the leaders of the Christian church after Jesus died were his family members, because it had to be the same branch of King David, I guess. At least that's what I have been told. And for whatever reason, James is pretty much edited out of the New Testament. There's a few brief mentions of him, and then there's the one general epistle of James, and mostly Paul just kind of did a hostile takeover of Christianity and the followers of Paul. And so James, who was actually the leader of Christianity, he was like the first pope or something, that he's pretty much edited out. He is downplayed because he and Paul apparently didn't get along. There was like this ideological divide between them. And apparently Paul's side won, and Paul turned Christianity not just into a sect of Judaism, but into a world religion, the state religion of the Roman Empire. So let's see here. Yeah. So, I mean, in answer to this long question here, let's see, where's the question mark? It's right here at the end. Let's see. So, how can you claim Buddhism, which with many more factors and circumstances to preserve their teachings, would end up having half the text common to all schools be added on later? Well, I mean, it's not many more factors. About the only factor in favor of the Buddhists is that the Buddha was much more effective as a teacher, so there would be more people who would actually understand what he was teaching. But like I said in the video, when you're determining what's going to be official doctrine, it's usually not the wisest monks. The wisest monks are out alone in a forest meditating. It's the busybody school monks, the politician monks. They're the ones who are making a lot of the decisions with regard to what to include and what to edit out of this body of, I mean, you can't really call it literature because it wasn't even written down yet. And again, in ancient India and in the Orient in general, maybe not China so much, but there was a kind of surreal approach to reality. It's all mind-made kind of stuff. They just did not have the same empirical sense of objectivity that existed in the West. So it resulted in more distortion, more weird stuff getting added in. Not that the New Testament doesn't have weird stuff added in, but there's more of it in the Pali texts. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Exaggeration. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name. It's not really a common name, I'm pretty sure. Exaggeration, I think. And Exaggeration says, what do you think of the Theravada Buddhist conflict with Rohingya Muslims? And there's really not much of a conflict going on anymore in Burma with Rohingya Muslims because most of them were driven out into Bangladesh. And then after they were driven out, the certain governments and not-for-profit organizations, they're pressuring the Burmese government to let them come back in again and resettle. And the Rohingyas didn't even want to come back. They'd rather stay in refugee camps in Bangladesh than come back to Burma and take their chances with the military government. So, I mean, there's not much of a conflict going on anymore between Theravada Buddhists in Burma and Rohingya Muslims. Not that I know of, unless somehow they did come back. But there is the 969 movement in Burma, led by Ashin Wirathu, or at least it used to be led by Ashin Wirathu. I never really was interested in it all that much. But there are some of the most famous Sayadaws in Burma, like Thiragu Sayadaw is an outspoken critic of, Muslim immigrants into Burma. Burma should be kept for the Buddhists, that kind of a thing. At least the ethnic Burmese heartland of Burma. So a lot of the ethnic groups on the fringes, the geographical fringes of Burma, they're Christians or whatever, largely due to missionaries during British colonial times. But the Burmese, they are very traditionalist and conservative with regard to their religion. They really don't give a shit about political correctness. So, I mean, the Rohingya Muslims were brought in by the British to settle newly cleared areas for farming. And so the Burmese don't even really consider the Rohingyas to be legitimate citizens because they were just installed in Burma by the colonialist oppressor. So there are a lot of Burmese people, and it's understandable, I suppose, because there's a lot of people like this, in the West also, who just do not want their traditional culture to be overwhelmed by people who may be antagonistic to their traditional culture. And in Burma, it's just considered to be a truism, just a kind of obvious fact that if you've got a small number of Muslims, you got a few Muslims in the village, they're perfectly fine. They're good neighbors. A lot of the time, the village butcher will be a Muslim simply because it's not considered to be immoral for a Muslim to kill, whereas it is for a Buddhist, obviously. But once you get a certain critical mass, they start becoming aggressively intolerant. So, well, I mean, they're just not politically correct enough to just, sit by and cheer on the death of their traditional culture. And so, to some degree, some of them are fighting back. But it's not so much a religious thing. It's not like, it's more of a cultural thing. And to some degree, it's a kind of xenophobia thing. Xenophobia just being like distrust of foreign ways and so forth. Foreign people, I guess, to some degree. And we people in the West can disapprove of that or whatever, but the Burmese don't give a shit whether we disapprove or not. So, they have the right to decide for their own country what they're going to do. Right now, they're ruled by a military dictatorship, I'm pretty sure. And I don't think the military dictatorship is really keen on resettling or importing lots of Muslims or really any kind of foreign migrants into Burma. And they're a sovereign nation, supposedly, although they're becoming more and more just sort of like a satellite of China. But the Chinese really aren't pro-Muslim either, so there's no problem there, I guess. And, yeah, I guess I answered that question, so I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Rui. And Rui says, I wonder whether in the time of the Buddha, there were many who, after hearing a few sermons, took off on their own and reached final liberation. And that's what the texts say. I'm not exactly sure what Rui means here. If he means hearing a few sermons and then taking off on their own without like converting to Buddhism, sort of like Siddhartha in the Hermann Hesse novel. He heard a few sermons and he decided that he was just going to do it on his own. Some of us are just not really followers. So, the whole unquestioning obedience thing just doesn't work for some of us. So I'm not sure if Rui means that just people who heard a few of his sermons and then as Buddhists, maybe like Buddhist monks, went off and meditated. And if that's the assumption, then if we can trust the text at all, it happened a lot. It's just like the standard story. You got somebody who comes to the Buddha, talks with him, the Buddha converts him, he gets a little bit of teaching, he goes off, meditates diligently in the forest, and before long he becomes enlightened. It may not have happened nearly as much as it is claimed in the texts. In the text you can have thousands and thousands of people all becoming enlightened simultaneously. But, I got no problem with the idea that it did happen. But with regard to people who heard a few teachings of the Buddha, they met the Buddha in person, were inspired to go and practice, but they didn't want to be ordained as Buddhist monks. And they just went off as a non-denominational ascetic and went off and meditated in the forest and became enlightened. That could have happened too. It probably wasn't as common, since probably the people that were really moved and like converted just became Buddhist monks. If they weren't, then you'd have to have a certain kind of character to really be moved and to really like commit to what the Buddha taught, while at the same time not becoming one of his followers. So I'm not exactly sure which way Rui was intending with this question, whether he was referring to monks or whether he was referring to people that just heard some sermons of the Buddha and then just went off on their own, kind of like a modern Westerner might do. They just became eclectic. They just combined some of the Buddhist teachings with some of Mahavira's teachings and maybe threw in a little bit from Makali Gosala and, some Brahmanistic stuff. They'd studied the Upanishads a little bit and then they just went off and with this kind of eclectic combination of views or something, or maybe the Buddha was teaching no view, like in the Atthakavagga, and so they just considered it unnecessary to join any kind of tradition if it's like all you got to do is just not believe anything. So, I mean, it's hard to say exactly. You can't really answer these kind of questions with any kind of certainty because I do not have the clairvoyance to look into ancient India and see what was actually going on there. All we have is texts that are not entirely reliable, and some of the stuff like they're talking about non-Buddhists, they might not even get mentioned. I can't recall any stories in the texts of a person coming and listening to the Buddha and not converting, not becoming a monk, and then just going off and becoming enlightened anyway. I mean, according to Orthodox tradition, if you're not an ordained monastic in Buddhism, if you become enlightened, you have to be ordained very quickly afterwards, or you're going to die. You're just going to have a sudden death. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't particularly like getting questions that I really can't answer very well, but it sometimes does happen, and it's already happened a few times already in this one video. Because sometimes people are asking about hypotheticals, or they're asking, what happened, and, there might be no records of it. So it's like, how do you know? Even if I had some kind of clairvoyance, I mean, how do I know that it's being accurate in this case? I might be accidentally peeking into an alternative version of reality or something that doesn't apply to us right here or something. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo is asking, it's three questions that strike me as very similar. So he says, my questions pertain to the fact that in the very near future, AI will be replacing many of the aspects of life that people find meaningful, like work, art, music, relationships, etc. So the first question is, how do you think most people will react to the AI takeover and the seeming meaninglessness that will come with it? And it seems to me that finding meaning in life is kind of like feeling pride. That pride is something that you're born with. It's most people, it's not that they have to rise up to some level of prominence or success before they feel proud. If you're just a proud person to begin with, you can be proud of anything. You can be proud of how many beers you can drink without puking. You can be proud of how big your feet are. You can be proud of the number of women you have dumped on. It doesn't matter. You'll come up, if you've got this tendency to pride, you're going to take pride in something. You're going to be proud about something. And I think it's pretty much the same way with finding meaning in life. That if you just have a tendency to find meaning in life, and pretty much everybody does, then you're going to find it somehow or other. I mean, it might be something silly like, getting into immersive video games, or, some sort of virtual reality stuff, or just getting a hobby, getting a fish tank maybe, or whatever it is, building model cars, I don't know. But, I mean, relationships, I assume AI will replace relationships for a lot of people, which is not good for the human race, because you have to have like real people getting together in order to make babies and perpetuate the species. But I mean, it's going to weed out kind of the misfits, the biological misfits, the evolutionary misfits. So, there might be a lot of malaise, people that just, maybe a lot of unemployment simply because AI is going to be replacing a lot of people in their jobs. So let's see here. What is the question again? Sometimes I got to reread the question just because I've talked so long that I've forgotten what the question is. How do you think most people will read or react to the AI takeover and the seeming meaninglessness that will come with it? I think a lot of them will just follow along with whatever they're told to follow along with, which is the way it seems like most people in the world are. It's just they're told, just follow along with this and everything will be fine. And so they'll just follow along with that, whether everything really will be fine or not. There's some people are going to just be in despair and rebel, which is always the case. Any kind of change that happens, there's going to be some people who don't like it and rebel against it. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, with regard to meaninglessness, I mean, from my philosophical point of view, you're better off with meaninglessness because meaning is samsara. Meaning is a kind of illusion. So, um, see, how do you think most people will react to the AI takeover? Yeah, I think a lot of people are just going to get immersed in virtual reality kind of stuff, and see, take up hobbies. Maybe there's going to be a certain reaction against it, so that people will actually spend more money just to deal with an actual human than dealing with this AI. And one thing I've noticed with regard to technology, like computer technology, is like whenever something is developed, it gets put out there when it's still got all these bugs in it, so that nothing ever really runs really well. It's like you got to have the newest version, which is still like practically a prototype, and there's all these glitches, and so you can't just have a method that's all worked out from 3 years ago. You got to have the newest version, which is it's going to be like way more imperfect than the version before that in certain respects, anyway. But I don't know if that is actually helping to answer this question or not. Might just help some people to just not get sucked into the AI thing. But I think if a corporation is going to save money by having, AI, you just talk to the AI when you're at the drive-through window, which I think is already happening. You're not talking to a real human. You're talking to this artificial intelligence, which then records your order, and then maybe, just maybe, an actual human will be involved in the process of cooking that order and serving it to you. But yeah, it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. It's not so much for me a matter of meaninglessness as a matter of, I mean, there's going to be a lot of unemployed people, I think, and so there might have to be some way of finding busy work jobs that for actual humans to do, because otherwise we're kind of screwed. It's just going to be, everyone's going to get this stipend, like an allowance to live on, and then where's the money going to come from? But with regard to finding meaning in life, I think that people, like I was saying earlier, people that generally have a tendency to find meaning somehow, somewhere, and they'll come up with something. It may be that their new meaning in life is just to protest against the meaninglessness, or even to like have this new philosophy of meaninglessness or some such. That'll be their meaning in life. That'll be, their purpose is to just rail against the lack of purpose. But people will find a way somehow or another. And I'm just going to move on to Romeo's next question, because as I say, these are all interrelated, very similar questions. Do you think it is possible for people to find meaning in their lives, considering the seeming meaninglessness that will come with the AI takeover? If so, how? And I think I've already answered that. Do you think it is possible for people to find meaning in their lives? Yeah, of course it is. Of course it's possible. I mean, Dharma's not going to go anywhere. I mean, there's still that. Christianity probably isn't going to go anywhere. So people are going to find meaning. I mean, it's like a need for any unenlightened person to have meaning in their lives. And so, I mean, when it's a need like that, you're going to find something. See. Yeah, I guess I've already answered that question. I hope so anyway, because I'm moving on to the third one here. Can Dhamma help people cope with the seeming meaninglessness that will come with the AI takeover? If so, how? So I've already partially answered this question, and that, as I already said, Dhamma's not going anywhere. AI is not going to replace Dhamma, probably, at least not for everybody. It may be that you have AI bots that are, answering spiritual questions and so forth. Whether they'll have any actual wisdom or not, I don't know. But also, I mean, it will help some people who are more advanced in that Dhamma, or the archaic Buddhism, like in the Atthakavagga, the Buddha is saying, I mean, meaning is the problem. You don't want meaning. It's like meaning is samsara. Meaning is what keeps you trapped in samsara. And so, some people will cling to like a lower level of Dhamma, a more kind of a normie level of Dhamma as their meaning, the meaning that they need to get through life. And then more advanced people may actually embrace meaninglessness. They might do it more easily since everything is becoming apparently more and more meaningless due to AI. So then they'll like embrace the early teachings of the Atthakalagas. At least a few people probably will. And where it's saying, it's like, don't have meaning. Meaning's not good for you anyway. So, yeah, it might be like a resurgence of existentialism or something. But with regard to the actual way that AI is going to manifest in society, I mean, I really can't predict that. Other than that, there's a lot of jobs, like Romeo was saying here, a lot of jobs are going to be phased out because humans are going to be replaced by machines. But that's been going on for a long time. It's like John Henry against the steam drill. It's the people have been protesting that. Just think of all the poor the blacksmiths, or what are the ones, farriers, the ones that shoed horses. They all lost their jobs because the invention of cars and so forth. And I mean, it's just going to keep happening. I mean, so long as technology keeps developing, there's going to be like new jobs for people to do, which may not be predictable at present. And then there's going to be older jobs that get phased out. I mean, the chariot makers they've really hit hard times because, I mean, the demand for chariots is so low nowadays. So we're just gonna have to wait and see, I guess. That's the best attitude, especially from a Buddhist point of view. It's like, don't worry about the future, especially if the future is uncertain, which it generally is. You just wait and see what happens. So I'm willing to do that. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, I recently heard a quote by Bhutan Buddhist monk Zongsar Khyentse Rinpoche. I will paste it here exactly as he said it. It had a big impact on me because lately I felt that I had stopped making progress with my meditation practice, and I find myself sitting on the cushion wasting my time with thoughts running wild, and the mind is uninterested and unengaged. I can relate to that. Could you please read it out loud and then provide your perspective on it? Thank you. And then he has beginning of quote. So this next is going to be from Zongsar Khyentse Rinpoche. Beginning of quote. Wisdom is the most important. All the others are secondary. Do you understand? To see the truth is the most important. Morality, discipline, even meditation, even so-called meditation, as precious as it sounds, if your meditation is not making you see the truth, you are basically rotting your butt. Do you understand? Sitting on something, it's useless. Okay, maybe it's going to relax you a little bit. It may sort of make you calm down a little bit. So what? If you don't see the truth, a little bit of calm that you can achieve in many ways. To see the truth is always so important. End of quote. And I completely agree with this. I mean, it's like the whole point is to know reality. That's wisdom is the highest virtue in Buddhism. It's like you have to have good sila, good morality, which allows you to have good concentration, which then allows you to have wisdom. So wisdom is like the goal. You don't become enlightened without perfecting your wisdom. And in this case, the perfecting your wisdom just means getting down to zero delusion, regardless of any, philosophical framework that you might be dealing with. You have to get down to zero delusion. And I mean, that's the goal. I mean, that's really number one. So yeah, I mean, it is more important than morality or discipline or meditation, because the whole point of morality, discipline, and meditation is to get you to wisdom. I mean, that's the whole point. We're wallowing in delusion and unreality, and so we're supposed to free ourselves from that. We're supposed to be liberated from that. We liberate ourselves from unwisdom. So yeah, I would agree with the Rinpoche, the venerable one. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jack. And Jack says, my question is about taming the mind, tying it down to a pole like a wild animal. Can you just elaborate on this? Where does it come from in the teachings, etc.? And I actually looked briefly for the like what sutta this simile is in. There is a simile with regard to mindfulness of breathing, not the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing, but just mindfulness of breathing. And the simile is you're taming an animal by kind of tethering it to a pole. And the pole represents the breath. The animal, the wild animal, is your undisciplined mind, and the tether is mindfulness. It's like whenever the animal tries to get away, this tether will keep it from getting away from the pole until finally the animal will stop struggling against this tether and just stay near the pole of its own accord. So it's like mindfulness of breathing. If your mind starts wandering away from the breath, with mindfulness, you bring it back to the breath again. And you just keep doing that and doing that and doing that until your mind just naturally stays with the breath. And so you have domesticated, tamed your mind by using mindfulness of breathing. And I don't remember what sutta it's in, and I'm pretty sure it's not in the Majjhima Nikaya, because I looked in the Majjhima Nikaya and I just did not see it. In Bhikkhu Bodhi's like index of similes, it wasn't in the index of similes. At least it wasn't in there with regard to taming animals or tying them to poles or any such thing. But it is a sutta using the simile of an animal tethered to a pole as a simile for how you tame your own mind through using the rope of mindfulness to keep it on the breath. The breath is the pole. So, I suppose I successfully answered that one. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Trzaskaziz. And Trzaskaziz says, I am using my 3 questions here on this one queue because I want a little deeper analysis. I know this is Buddhist Marine channel. I don't know how the Marine gets in there. I know this is Buddhist Marine channel, but could you please say something more about your interpretation of the letter of James? You probably may want to read it again after all this time. And actually, I did before I did this video, because it's only like 4 pages long. It's a short little chapter in the New Testament that probably a lot of Christians are unaware of, because it really doesn't get a whole lot of press. Partly because, as I said earlier, James pretty much got edited out of the Bible, and his dominant role in early Christianity just kind of got, I don't know, memory hold or something. But it turns out I do have a Bible. It's a good one. It's this one right here. It's a Catholic Bible, I think, due to the Maltese cross down there. And also there's like some little Latin inscription in here from somebody. Yeah. I won't try to find the Latin inscription, I guess. Oh, yeah. Here, wait. The imprimatur. Yeah, and the censor deputaris. Censor deputaris is the Reverend Kenneth H. Shiner. But this is a good copy of the Bible, a good edition of the Bible, because it's got footnotes, it's got maps, it's got alternative renderings. You know, it's like there's like the scene, I think it's in John, where the woman is taken in adultery, and then Jesus says, you know, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. That there's a footnote saying that in some early manuscripts, this is found in Luke and not in John, or there's actually a footnote when it's talking about Mary being a virgin. You know, there's like the prophecy in the Old Testament of a virgin will give birth to a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, which means God is with us. It points out that the Hebrew word, or the original Hebrew, it doesn't mean virgin. It just means a young woman. It just means a young woman will give birth to a son, and his name will be Emmanuel. And it was the early Christians who really were not adept at Hebrew, were relying on a Greek translation called the Septuagint, which mistranslated that word, and they translated it as virgin when really it didn't even mean virgin. And so Jesus' mother got turned into a virgin just because of a mistranslation of a passage in the Old Testament. But the general epistle of James, James was very wise. I think he was wiser than St. Paul. And like I was saying, he was the leader of Christianity after Jesus was crucified, assuming, of course, that Jesus ever existed. There's always going to be people out there saying, you are so gullible. You think that Jesus actually existed. You think that there's an actual moon landing. You think that the earth is a sphere. But just for the sake of argument, just hypothetically, let's assume that Jesus really did exist. And he had a brother named James who was his successor as leader of the church in Jerusalem, especially. And this is apparently a letter from him. And most of it is just like basic morality. Some of it, I read in a Bible commentary once, that some of it is kind of making jibes at St. Paul, because as I mentioned earlier, James and Paul did not see eye to eye. So, he's talking about, faith alone is not good enough, because Paul was really into the faith, just your redemption through faith kind of a thing. Whereas James is saying, faith without works is dead. But he did have some wisdom. And what I did mention, I think one reason why Trizaskas was asking about this is because I was saying that James probably would have been a good Buddhist. He had some wisdom, and there is some like quasi-Buddhism that you can find in the general epistle of James. For example, let's see here. Let's see, where is it? Okay. Where do all the fights and quarrels among you come from? They come from your desires for pleasure, which are constantly fighting within you. You want things, but you cannot have them, so you are ready to kill. You strongly desire things, but you cannot get them, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have what you want because you do not ask God for it. And when you ask, you do not receive it because your motives are bad. You ask for things to use for your own pleasures. It's essentially all the problems in the world are caused by desire. All the suffering is caused by desire, which is second noble truth. But he does have some stuff in here that it's some of my favorite teachings of Christianity are found in the general epistle of James. Like this part, now listen to me, you that say, tomorrow or today or tomorrow we will travel to a certain city where we will stay a year and go into business and make a lot of money. You don't even know what your life tomorrow will be. You're like a puff of smoke which appears for a moment and then disappears. What you should say is this: if the Lord is willing, we will live and do this or that. But now you are proud and you boast. All such boasting is wrong. And that reminds me a lot of like Ajahn Chah, where he's talking about, everything is unsure. It's all unsure. And so, this one teaching in the New Testament that's found in the general epistle of James is something that I've pretty much taken to heart. I'll say God willing or inshallah. I'm not just going to say I'll do it. So, I'll do it, inshallah. I'll do it, God willing. I'll do it if I don't die first and nothing prevents me from doing it, because it does seem kind of strange that people will say for sure they're going to do something in the future when really it's uncertain. You really can't know for sure. Also, let's see here. There was another one. Well, yeah, there was another good one in here, but no, I don't see it. Okay, that's good enough. So, most of it is just sort of basic fundamental morality, just basic wisdom for the common person who wants to improve their life and live a better life. And of course, it's within sort of like a Hebrew, very early Christian context, but there is a lot of wisdom in it. And it is one of the wisest parts of the entire Bible, in my opinion. So, let's see. What is the question here? Could you please say something more about your interpretation of the letter of James? Okay, I think I just did that. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Don Fades. And Don Fades says, if the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is considered to be the Buddha's first sermon, where does the Atthakavagga fit into that timeline, pre or post? Please, would you provide some clarity on this? And it is true that according to tradition, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta was the Buddha's first discourse after his enlightenment to the 5 ascetics. You know, if you ever see a picture of the Buddha and there's like 5 monks sitting on the ground in front of him, listening to him, then that is symbolic of the Buddha's first sermon. And it is kind of interesting that the Pali scholar K.R. Norman, who translates for the Polytext Society, or at least did years ago, I don't know if he's still alive and kicking now, but he points out that the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is somewhat anachronistic. It assumes that the hearers are already familiar with certain basic doctrines of Buddhism. And so it may be that it is like a distorted, garbled version of the Buddha's first sermon, if it isn't just somehow somebody just said this sermon, which is dealing with basic Dhamma, you know, sort of like an intro to the Four Noble Truths and the middle path, or at least one middle path, one of many middle paths, that this must be his first sermon. Or, you know, it may be that it got distorted over time for the reasons that I've already discussed in response to Siavakshan Sipad Zidana. So it could be that it is like a garbled or distorted version of the Buddha's first sermon. But as it exists today, it doesn't represent as archaic of a Buddhist teaching as, for example, the teachings of the Atthakavagga and the Sutta Nipata, which I consider to be the largest fragment of truly archaic Buddhism still in existence, at least that we know of. There may be something on an inscription buried under the ground in India somewhere that we don't know about. So, personally, it may be that the Buddha in his first sermon did address the Four Noble Truths, maybe without the fourth noble truth being an eightfold path. It may have just been that there is a path, and like the middle path between extremes, he may have addressed that also. But in its elaborated form as it exists today, it's probably got some anachronisms and some changes in it. And so it may be the Buddha's first sermon was something along the lines of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, but nevertheless, regardless of that, regardless of the exact chronology of that, the Atthakavagga is clearly pre-orthodox, very archaic, very early Buddhism that at the very least you could say it was an advanced teaching taught to his advanced disciples very early on in his career. But again, it's hard to say exactly what the situation is because we do not have the divine eye to look back into the past and see exactly what the chronology of everything is and what the Buddha did and didn't say and when he did or didn't say it. So we can just make educated guesses. So I'm just going to move on to Don Fade's next question, which is, what is Māra's deal? What benefits can he possibly get from all his relentless tempting activities and leading beings astray? And I mean, Māra, he is the cosmic bad guy. He's the supernatural villain in Buddhism. You know, he's like the Buddhist devil, although there are some significant differences between Māra and Satan. But I mean, I've never really seen a need for a cosmic bad guy. We seem to do a good enough job of, like, I don't know, messing ourselves up. You know, it's all our own karma. The cosmic bad guy isn't really necessary in that regard. He can't do anything to us that it isn't our karma to have done to us. And what benefits does he possibly get? I think the traditional answer to that is that, I mean, he's sort of like a jealous god, and he doesn't want anyone escaping from his realm, and his realm is samsara. So that's one difference between him and Satan, in that Māra is like essentially the god of samsara, at least in a symbolic level. He's the god of at least the lower levels of samsara. So he doesn't want anyone like escaping from his power because he's power hungry. He wants to control as many beings as possible, and apparently an infinite number just isn't enough to satisfy him. But I mean, I have had this idea that if there really was a Satan or there really was a Māra, that they would be atheists. I mean, Satan would be an atheist. He would have this worked out in his head that there is that this God, that there is no highest God that transcends everything. He might just have like this enemy God, like the Old Testament Yahweh or something. But I think that Māra, they would be completely unspiritual, and so they'd be like a smug atheist on the internet who just sneers at people that don't believe the same as them, who still believe in God or whatever. And so there might be some spite involved in that. Although, with my best guess is that there is no official cosmic bad guy. You may have malevolent, wrathful, like higher beings. You may have malevolent gods, small g gods, but I don't think it's going to be like their official job to try to keep people from becoming enlightened, because that's really what he's doing. That's what Mara's deal is. It's not like he's trying to get people to go to hell like Satan does. It's not like he's trying to keep people out of heaven. If he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because either way, you're still stuck in samsara, because the heaven realms are still samsaric. They're still in samsara. Nibbana is off the scale. So that's like beyond his control. And so he doesn't want anyone going beyond his control. It could be even kind of a jealousy thing. It may be that he just knows he's not going to get it. So he doesn't want anyone else to get it either. Kind of a dog in the manger kind of attitude. Just arguing for the sake of argument that Māra actually exists. So let's see, what benefits can possibly get from all his relentless tempting activities and leading beings astray? Just the satisfaction of, if he really is malevolent, then it's the satisfaction of just fucking with people, messing them up. Or, it could be, again, like the jealousy issue of he doesn't want anyone escaping his grasp, or that he doesn't want people attaining what he can't begin to comprehend. It's like the gods themselves don't know what the Buddha's mind is like resting upon when he's in deep meditation. It's like even gods that can read minds, it's like they just get to this void when they try to read the Buddha's mind. He's just like infinite space or something. And it may be that for whatever reason, Māra just resents the very idea of that. It's like it demeans his dignity to have people wiser than him or escaping from his realm or whatever. So I think I'm just going to move on to Don Fades' next question. And I'm looking again just to make sure we really are recording, and we seem to be, so yeah. And we got light distortion here. Just a second. I got light shining in my face. That should be better a little bit. Nope. That's weird. What is that? Oh, it's like this little crack, like where the strings go through the blind. That leaves like this little crack, and that's where the light's coming through. So, oh well. We'll just have to put up with it, I guess. So, anyways, Don Fades' third question. What kind of booze do you think people were drinking back in ancient India? I would imagine social or occasional drinking wasn't really a thing back then, like you would either not drink at all or you would be one of the village drunkards. Well, like for example, when it's discussing the fifth precept, which is Sura Merya, it's talking about no consumption of Sura Merya. And that's Sura, if I remember correctly, is defined as alcoholic beverages made of grain. And Merya would be alcoholic beverages made from other things like fruit. So that would be like wine. So it would be sort of like beer and wine. So apparently it did exist. That there's more than one kind. Although I would guess I mean, just based on like Burma. I lived in Burma, which has flora and fauna and climate and everything, and even a lot of like this the way people live their lives similar to ancient India, or at least ancient Ganges Valley. The main booze of choice, every culture seems to have it, is toddy, which is like fermented palm sap, like from a toddy palm, which is also called a sugar palm. It looks kind of like a palmyra. It's got like fan-like leaves like this, which is how palm trees got their name, I guess. And also coconut palms, which have more longer, frondier kind of leaves. It's sort of like maple syrup. And maple syrup, you got to boil it down. It's very watery when it first comes out of the tree. And it's the same way with palm trees. It's this very watery, sweet sap. And it starts to ferment pretty quickly. So they just drink, it's tanye ga, it's called. It's bitter palm water. And tanye jo is sweet palm water, which I used to drink as a monk. It's kind of like a maple flavored beverage that you can drink, which is this palm sap, watery palm sap. So I would assume that there was a lot of that getting drunk back then, if the cultivation of like palm sugar and palm sap was a thing in the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time. But I mean, it's talking in the ancient texts about fermented grain and fermented fruits and fermented leaves and this kind of stuff. So I'm sure they experimented a lot with that. I assume that the Indo-Aryan invaders were drinking when they got there. It's like, they probably were smoking cannabis and drinking alcohol and taking certain other drugs even before they got into India, the Indo-Aryans. So, they were sort of like Scythians when they first invaded. A little bit like Scythians anyway. So, yeah, it wouldn't be any kind of hard liquor. I'm pretty sure that distillation hadn't been invented yet. But various kinds of like fermented beverages, grain, maybe some kind of mead, and also the fermented toddy or like the watery palm sap stuff. And it probably would be a little more common than Don Fades would like to suppose, because of course in ancient India, not everybody was saintly. Saintly people are the minority pretty much everywhere you go. So, they wouldn't have bothered to make a rule against it if it wasn't a thing that was happening in society. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from GameFap. And GameFap says, can artificial intelligence reach enlightenment? And the jury is still out on that. We're just going to have to wait and see, I guess. I don't see why not. If you can have intelligence based, in this version of reality, this version of samsara, you've got intelligence based on a gooey blob of meat with neurons in it. Why would that have any kind of monopoly on sentience and wisdom when you might be able to have like a replica of that brain programmed into a computer and something similar going on in the computer? That's possible. It seems to me, I don't see any reason why it should be impossible. It may be that people just won't ever get smart enough or foolhardy enough to program a sentient computer. But I don't see why it would necessarily be impossible. That you could have rebirth linking consciousness appearing in a computer that is like fertile ground for complex mental processes, in the way that a human brain is. And one of my favorite science fiction authors is, why am I drawing a blank? He wrote The Long Afternoon of Earth. Man, that is weird. He's one of my favorite science fiction authors. Anyway, one of his favorite themes in his stories is religions based on omniscient computers. So it's not just enlightened computers, it's omniscient computers. It's like you get it to a certain critical mass of complexity and like recursive self-improvement, and then it just like hits this traction and just takes off and becomes essentially enlightened. And people would have one of these computers, they might carry them around on like a backpack, or just have them set up on an altar in their house. They go to the omniscient computer with all their problems and so forth. But then again, I talked to a Burmese monk who was an Abhidhamma scholar. I think I was writing a blog post about this issue at one point, and I asked him if he thought it was possible for a computer to become conscious, not just enlightened, not necessarily as far as enlightened even, but even for it to become sentient. And he just flatly said, no, that would be impossible. He was very dogmatic Abhidhamma scholar, and somewhere in the Abhidhamma, it says you have to have like kamaja rupa or something, that this like karma born matter that the consciousness has to arise into or something. So personally, my best answer is I don't see how it would be impossible in theory. But some other people, I think there's at least one person on the Discord server who also considers it to be just a ludicrous idea that you could have sentience in a machine, but why the brain isn't just a kind of wet, gooey machine, I don't know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga-U. Yuga-U starts with, hello, how are you? And I won't consider this to be one of the questions, I guess. So I'm as fine as could be expected for someone who recently became unemployed and is out looking for a new source of money to pay the bills. At least I still have this job. Doesn't pay very well, but I'm not doing it for money. So yeah, I'm healthy. I'm doing all right. So that one won't count. So Yugo's first question is, why do people exaggerate things? And one reason why they exaggerate things is just to tell a better story. But a more important reason why they exaggerate things is it makes it easier to justify their position. You know, if they like build up their position more than it really is. So, you know, they get mad about something. It's like, you've done this 50 times already, and it might be like 3 times. You know, it's like, it's just a way of justifying their position in a sense. It's kind of bolstering their own position. I assume that would be the main reason for exaggeration. And I mean, it's easier to do than just flat out lying. You know, at least it's based in reality. You know, it's sort of like taking liberties with reality to some degree, but at least you're not just making up a bunch of total bullshit. So people that are averse to lying maybe might still take a little recourse in exaggeration, mainly just to support their own position, but also sometimes in certain cases just to tell a funnier story, or, you know, a more entertaining story, or, you know, a more powerful story or something like that. So I'm just going to move on to Yugu's next question. Do you think that the New Testament is just people doing exaggeration of some events, like how Gospels are becoming more and more unbelievable? And I mean, certainly there's exaggeration in just about every religious text. There's Buddhist texts have got exaggerations, I'm sure. You know, like when some Buddha in the past gave a Dhamma sermon, and, you know, a zillion gajillion people all became enlightened simultaneously. You can find just these huge numbers of people becoming enlightened. The Buddha's retinue is, you know, thousands of monks, and in those days, I mean, how are you going to feed thousands of monks? They couldn't even gather their own food. Or in the commentaries, it says that the city of Sawati had a population of something like, it was just some outrageous number. It was like 70 million people, with most of them being Buddhist Aryas, at least Sotapannas, even though historically Sawati wasn't even a stronghold of Buddhists. I think it was like the Ajivakas or something, really. That was like a hub for the Ajivakas. But, I mean, there's no way you could have 70 million people living in an ancient city. They just did not have the infrastructure, the way of getting food in and waste out for 70 million people. So, do I think that the New Testament is just people doing exaggeration of some event? I don't think it's just that. I assume that there is some factual statements in the New Testament. I think there's probably a lot of the sayings of Jesus, not most of them, but some of the sayings attributed to Jesus are really sayings of Jesus. I don't know why they would exaggerate certain things like his crucifixion, for example. I think some of it's beyond exaggeration. I think some of what's in the New Testament and the Bible in general is just made up, like just doctoring the life of Jesus of Nazareth so that it fits the Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah. You know, like Mary being a virgin, that was even a mistake based on a mistranslation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Jesus being born in Bethlehem, he had to be born in Bethlehem because one of the Old Testament prophets says the Messiah is going to be born in the city of Bethlehem. So you had the followers of Jesus who knew that he came from Nazareth having to come up with some story of how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And they came up with two entirely different stories. Matthew and Luke come up with two entirely different stories explaining how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. In one version, I don't remember whether it's Luke or Matthew, the implication is that he and his family, you know, his mother and father and him as a baby he was born in Bethlehem in their own house, presumably. But then King Herod had this decree that all baby boys were going to be massacred. And so they ran away to Egypt. And then when they moved back after King Herod died, they still weren't sure about King Herod's son. So they moved to Nazareth. And then in the other version, it was they apparently started off in Nazareth, and then they had to go to Bethlehem for the census because of some decree of Augustus Caesar. And that's the version where there was no room at the inn and he had to be born in a manger and all that. And then they just went back to Bethlehem. Went back to Nazareth. There's no mention at all of them fleeing to Egypt for years. So there is some exaggeration in the New Testament. There is just some objective statements of fact. There's some garbled attempts at statements of fact. There's opinion, like in the letters of Paul, for example, lots of opinion. There's just some made up stuff. So it's just a big accumulation of all this different stuff. And the same is true of Buddhist texts also. So let's see here. Do I think that the New Testament is just people doing exaggeration of some events? I don't think it's just that. There is some exaggeration in there, but that's not all there is. And how the Gospels are becoming more and more unbelievable. I don't know exactly what this means, that the Gospels are becoming more and more unbelievable. I mean, like, people are just believing them less because they're becoming less Christian, or because some of the statements in the New Testament are becoming like more debunked by history or science or whatever. I'm not exactly sure what this second part means. The Gospels are becoming more and more unbelievable. That's either a cultural thing or like a scientific advancement thing or something. But I think I answered the actual question, so that's good enough, I think. And so I'm going to move on to Yugu's next question, which is, did our Buddha predict and say who will be future one, just like past did the same for him? That also is, it's not found in the earliest texts, this whole idea of a succession of Buddhas, where any Buddha who is a genuine bodhisattva, in Sanskrit, possibly mistranslated as bodhisattva, that in order to become a real bodhisattva, you have to receive what in Burmese is called a byādate, which means some Buddha, some fully enlightened Buddha, has to prophesy in your case that you're going to become a Buddha in some future age, a zillion gajillion eons from now. And I'm skeptical that goes all the way back to the original Buddha. That's a kind of mythology that Buddhists accept. Not all Buddhists, a lot of Buddhists. So like the Buddha before our Gautama Buddha was Kassapa Buddha. And the next Buddha after our Buddha, Gautama Buddha, is going to be Maitreya, or in Sanskrit, Maitreya Buddha. And there's already been lots of people claiming to be Maitreya Buddha, including L. Ron Hubbard, at least by his followers. I don't know if he himself claimed to be Maitreya Buddha, but some of his followers were strongly implying that L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, was Maitreya Buddha. But according to the tradition, a Buddha cannot arise when you've still got Buddhism from a previous Buddha. What has to happen is Buddhism has to completely die out, become extinct, and then another Buddha will arise who comes up with Dhamma on his own. He doesn't have a teacher teaching him this stuff. It's just through his own insight and wisdom and genius. He gets Dhamma, and then he starts Buddhism going again. He starts Dharma again. He gets the wheel rolling, which is why the Buddha's first sermon is called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is Dhammacakka is Dhamma wheel, Pavattana is rolling. So he started the wheel rolling with that first sermon. That's when Buddhism began. So did our Buddha predict and say who will be a future one, just like past did the same? According to tradition, he did talk about Maitreya Buddha, I think. I haven't heard of any dates, like some Brahmin comes up to him and then the Buddha prophesies, in some future world eon, you're going to be a Buddha called such and such, and give some details of that. I am skeptical. This was a later development of like the apotheosis of the Buddha. And then you wind up with this whole pantheon of Buddhas that I really don't think that was an original feature of archaic Buddhism. I think it was added later. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sculadin or Sculadine. And Sculadin or Sculadine says, would you kindly give a discourse on the three venoms of the pharmacracy? And then he's got his characteristic bullet points. One is the blue pill. I find this meme is often misunderstood. A lot of people believe everyone is genuinely asleep. 2 is the red pill. I find that this meme is almost completely misunderstood. I don't think I've heard anyone other than my guru identify it as samsaric. And 3 is the black pill. I find this meme is the irrational and far from leading to liberating insight, maybe akin to the death of knowledge, which was not ignorance, but ignorance of ignorance. And why he doesn't include the white pill, I don't know. Maybe it's like the 3-question limit. But yeah, of course, you also have the white pill. And so, the blue pill and the red pill, that's the 2 original pills. And they come from the movie The Matrix, I'm pretty sure. Like Morpheus holds out 2 pills, a red pill and a blue pill. He offers them to Neo and says, you take the blue pill and you're just going to essentially just go back to sleep. You're going to just go back right into samsara. You're going to forget all about anything beyond, the Matrix. You're just going to become, a good boy in the Matrix and just live the rest of your life, sleepwalking, essentially, in a dream state. Or the red pill, you take the red pill, you're going to get out of the Matrix. So, let's see. My discourse on the 3 venoms of the pharmacracy. Well, it's going to be 4 because you have to include the white pill also if you're going to include the black pill. But the 2 first ones, blue pill and red pill. The blue pill, that's just normies who essentially just want to believe what they're told. They want to believe that all this is reality. This is the only reality there is, or at least it's the highest one. And, they're just, in political parlance, the blue pill people generally are the ones who believe the mainstream media. They just follow along like sheep. Whereas the red pill are the people who are waking up. They're not enlightened necessarily. Although in the movie, Neo symbolically became enlightened at the end after he died and was essentially reborn due to the faith and love of his woman, Trinity. So the red pill, It's not necessarily enlightenment, but it's like you're starting to see through the illusion. You're starting to see that this is not reality, or especially in a political context, what the mainstream media is telling you, what the politicians are telling you is not reality. So, I mean, red pill, obviously, the implication is red pill is far superior to blue pill. Blue pill is an indoctrinated normie that is clueless with regard to reality. They just believe what they're told. Red pill, at least you're waking up. You may not be fully awake yet, but at least you've got this idea that this isn't reality, or what the projected reality from the establishment, that is not reality. Then might as well put the black pill in there. Black pill is next on the list. And black pill is just like cynicism and giving up. So it's, I mean, in a way, it could be just as bad as the blue pill. The blue pill, I mean, you still may have some hope. But then again, black pillars, they may become so depressed from their own black pillory that they're just going to finally take a different pill than that. But black pill really is just, we're all fucked. It doesn't matter. I give up. And then the white pill is, I mean, it's like extreme pessimism. And then the white pill is optimism. It's like Dr. Turley, our patriot professor, who helps us to think better so we can feel better in these crazy and turbulent times. And he's just totally upbeat, totally optimistic. And then when things don't go the way he is saying, that we're crushing it, and then we lose or whatever, like in 2020, he's just indignant and pissed off for a week or two. And then next thing you know, he's all, we're crushing it again. So the white pill is probably better than the black pill. Optimism is probably better than pessimism, in that at least you haven't given up hope. You haven't given up yet. Because really, in life, the only surefire way of failing is to quit. That's the only surefire way of just failure is just give up. And that's one reason why certain ancient civilizations like the early Romans, they wound up conquering the Western world. Because, I mean, you read some of their early history, it didn't matter what happened to them. They just absolutely refused to give up. There was like Hannibal has like conquered most of Italy. He's got most of Italy rebelling against the city of Rome, and the Romans just won't give up. They just would not stop. They'd send legion after legion. Some of those legions, like at Cannae, would just be wiped out. They just recruit more people and just keep fighting. They just would not stop. So, I mean, that's one of your best chances at enlightenment. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people who watch this have a dim view of Winston Churchill, but one of his famous sayings is, and it's not gonna be an exact quote, but it was along the lines of, success is the result of going from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. So, because sooner or later, I mean, if you just refuse to give up, the implication is sooner or later, maybe even just from random chance, or like your opponent messing up worse than you're just going to wind up being successful. So I don't know if being red-pilled is necessarily a venom. Getting back to School of Dean's original question here, would you kindly give a discourse on the three venoms of the pharmacracy? And I mean, the red pill is probably the healthiest pill to take, at least going with the original symbolism of what the red pill implied. Because the red pill, you're on the path to enlightenment. You're on the path of Dhamma, or you've begun to wake up. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Wilson. And whenever I see this name Wilson, I always think of that Tom Hanks movie about a soccer ball or a volleyball named Wilson. Anyways, Wilson says, you've done a compare-contrast of Buddhism with Hinduism and Christianity. Can you do one with Judaism and Islam? So I assume he wants me to do one comparing and contrasting Buddhism with Judaism and Buddhism with Islam, or does he want me to compare and contrast Judaism on the one hand and Islam on the other hand? because he says, can you do one? But that's one each, maybe. Sometimes, I mean, when you ask questions, you should make sure that the meaning is clear. If it's ambiguous, sometimes I can get confused. So, I mean, I have written a blog post on my blog, which is still up. I think you can find it in the URL links below this video. At least the blog itself. You might have to do some searching because it's an old blog post, just comparing Judaism and Islam. It's like, which one is more dangerous for Western civilization? That's about the most of a compare contrast I've done with Judaism versus Islam. You know, which is better, which is worse, kind of a thing. But with regard to videos, I did do some videos with comparing Buddhism, Hinduism, and Buddhism and Christianity. Also, we did one Buddhism and Atheism with Ajahn Punadamo. Oh, and Brian Aldiss was my favorite science fiction author that I was having the mental block with regard to several minutes ago. But yeah, it was Brian Rue and Ajahn Punadamo and I were doing these little discussion videos. And then because of Brian Rue's reputation, some of Ajahn Punadamo's supporters were just vehemently protesting against him doing videos. And so he decided he didn't want to die on that hill. So, you know, that wasn't going to be a battle he was willing to die for. So he just kind of backed out of these videos. I did hear from him that maybe this coming winter he might be willing to do some more, not with Brian probably, but at least he and I could do videos about whatever topics, some Buddhism oriented topics. But with regard to Judaism and Islam, there's really not a whole, well, I mean, you could compare Buddhism with Islam or Buddhism with Judaism too. But it seems like the differences to anyone who knows about both would be fairly clear. Yeah. So, I mean, it's possible, but I mean, it might be more realistic if I just did a little video just talking about them, although I might get in trouble for it because since I'm not a Jew or a Muslim, then I really do not have an extremely high opinion of either system. Also, I do have a blog post that you can look up on the blog explaining why many Buddhists have such a low opinion of Muslims. And this kind of touches on the whole thing about the Muslims in Burma, because it was Muslims who exterminated Buddhism in India. I mean, Buddhism may have been kind of on a shaky foundation even before the Muslim Turks invaded, but I mean, they were just exterminated. It was genocide. So I did write a relatively long blog post about that, including lots of long quotes from the Muslims themselves bragging about just wiping and putting Buddhists to the sword and so forth in the name of Allah the Benevolent, the Merciful. So I'm just going to move on to Wilson's second question here. Have you read The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes? If so, I'd love your take or any Buddhist take on it. Well, I haven't read the book. I've read about it, and a friend of mine named Otto Excelsior has read it, and he will mention this book by Julian Jaynes, The Theory of Julian Jaynes, in just about any video we do together. He'll have some convenient, like, I don't want to say excuse, but some convenient opportunity to mention Julian Jaynes in this theory of the bicameral mind. And so I know a little bit about this theory of Julian Jaynes, which is that before the Bronze Age collapse in ancient times, like when the Trojan War was fought, that'd be towards the end of this period, that people had a bicameral mind. It was almost like schizophrenia. Their mind was like the two hemispheres of their brain weren't really communicating very well. And so they would consider thoughts to be coming from outside of them. And that's actually a teaching of early Buddhism too, that thoughts, dhammas, or mental states, they're considered to be just like a sensory stimulus like coming from outside your mind somehow. It's just sort of like a visual image. You have the visual image, and then you've got the eye, and you've got eye consciousness, and you got the contact of the three, and then that creates visual consciousness. And in Buddhism, the thought, you've got, the mind base, you've got the thought, and then you've got the mind consciousness, and the contact of these three causes, mental consciousness to arise. So anyways, getting back to Julian Jaynes, though, he had this idea that people kind of believed in like animism and like polytheistic gods, partly because they considered their own thoughts to be implanted into their mind by these other beings. And it just seemed to them that that's what was happening. And if you read old texts, like Homer and so forth, it really does seem that, that's the people had this kind of idea. I'm kind of skeptical of it. And the whole idea with regard to the collapse of the Bronze Age collapse, which was like a bigger cataclysm than the collapse of the Roman Empire. It was like almost all of Western civilization collapsed somewhere around 1200 BC, if I remember correctly. Just almost all of it. There was Egypt kind of just shrank down to this little nucleus in Egypt. It had this empire before that. And also the Hittites got wiped out. Almost every town, city, and village on the Eastern Mediterranean got wiped out. Assyria, I think, also shrank way down into like this little state. And that's when the Semites kind of exploded, because they were like aggressive nomads that could survive this kind of thing better than sedentary people living in cities. And that's kind of how the Near East kind of became Semitic. So let's see. I also read an alternative theory, which is generally what I think would be more likely to be true, in that it's almost the opposite of this theory of the bicameral mind by Julian Jaynes. I can't remember who came up with the idea, but he was saying that now we've got a bicameral mind. We've got, our mind is less unified than it was in very, very ancient times. It just kind of seems that way to me, that people had a more unified mind in ancient times. Although, there is the evidence of people thinking, their own dreams and even their own thoughts are just like implanted into them. It's like they're hearing a voice in their head when it's really just their own mind thinking. But to them, it's like this voice of a god or something inside their head. But that might just be a cultural thing rather than any kind of neurophysiological thing going on with their brain. And anyways, the collapse of the Bronze Age, according to Julian Jaynes, was just becoming untenable. That this bicameral split mind that people had, it couldn't keep up. It couldn't cope with technological and cultural progress. And so there was just it was like a mass psychological collapse of Western civilization. And then this new kind of mind arose after that. And I'm kind of skeptical. I can't just categorically say it just didn't happen that way. But I do think it might be possible that we've got more of a split mind now. Like the left and right hemisphere just don't communicate very well with each other. I don't know who would have more mass hysteria, people before the Bronze Age collapse or people after the Bronze Age collapse. But there seems to be plenty of hysteria nowadays. And that's like, hysteria is caused by like two parts of your mind that just aren't communicating with each other. That you've got like these neurotic hysterical symptoms percolating up from the so-called subconscious mind due to repression or fear or unsatisfied desires or whatever. So, Otto Excelsior would be the person to talk about that. I could do a video with him. We have been in communication, although we've had a lot of upheaval lately. Both of us have. His mother became very unhealthy very recently, right around the same time that I became unemployed. So there is a possibility. He would love to talk about it. I'm sure he would, because he brings it up at every convenient opportunity. So with that, I'm just going to move on to Wilson's third question. And this is a toughie. He says, can you please define self and exist? This is not a joke question, and I'm not trying to argue. I'm still genuinely baffled by the idea of no self, and I'm trying to understand. So the first thing I did when I put this on my list, this question, I just looked it up in the dictionary, which is something I do a lot more than a lot of people will do. You know, it's like defer to the dictionary as just the starting point of understanding what a word means, because people just coming up with their own meanings for things, it does not make for good interpersonal communication. You know, it's good to kind of defer to a language authority on what a certain word means. So anyways, this is like the Oxford New American English Dictionary or some such. And it's got self, noun, a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others, especially considered as the object of introspection or reflexive action. So a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others, and that essential being is the main reason why Buddhism teaches no self, because there is no essential being. You know, it's all like dependently co-arising apparent phenomena, and it's very difficult to explain how you can have something that isn't real causing something else that isn't essentially real. You've got this whole web of these unrealities reinforcing each other so that it seems like they're real. But they have they have form, but they have no underlying essence. They are empty of essence. And that's a fundamental teaching of Mahayana, like especially Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka Buddhism really hammers away at that idea, and just like in a very intellectual and logical manner, just bashes away at the idea that anything has any kind of essence. Now you can have like a superficial apparent forms of things, but underneath, I mean, there's nothing really holding it up. It's just this web work of conditions, none of which really has any underlying essence. You know, it's just apparent forms that are like reinforcing the apparent reality of everything else. And it's very difficult to explain in any way that begins to make sense. So especially with regard to any essential being that distinguishes them from others, because I mean, there are some people, like people who like a more Upanishadic interpretation, who will say that there's just one underlying essence. You can say that nirvana or the Dharmakaya or whatever you want to call it is this underlying essence. But there is no individual difference in this. It's all just uniform. And it's like samsara, the apparent forms of samsara have this as their underlying essence. You know, sort of like some Christian mystics or just Christians in general, theologians or whatever, would say that all the 10,000 things of this world have God or the mind or spirit of God as their underlying essence. But even then, you don't have any self of this person versus the self of that person, because ultimately they all have the same self, like going with the Upanishads. So, and probably going with the Tao Te Ching, like Taoism also, that would be the case. You know, from the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, and from the two came the 10,000 things. So the Tao is like the ultimate, the absolute. So there's two ways you can interpret no self. I mean, there's more than two ways, but you could say that I mean, sort of like the small no self theory, which a lot of Mahayana Buddhists who aren't Madhyamaka would endorse, is that there is an underlying essence, but everything in the universe, all sentient beings share that same underlying essence. So it'd be like there's one self in the entire universe. Everyone is sharing the same self, if that makes any sense. And then there's the more radical, like the big no self theory, which is saying that because nibbana is completely off the scale, you can't call it an essence, that there really is no essence supporting the appearances of things. And you can say, well, why are there appearances of things? And the appearances themselves are not ultimately real. And it's very difficult to explain something like this because human languages simply are not devised to explain this kind of thing. They're more devised to explain, like, what are you going to have for dinner? That kind of thing. Worldly stuff. When you start trying to get away from the world, trying to get away from phenomena, then language, because language is itself a phenomenon, I mean, it just breaks down. You can't do it. It can't touch it. So I think Theravada Buddhism kind of goes with the idea that there is no personality. There is no unique person because, going with like Abhidhamma, Orthodox, Theravadan dogma, one of their explanations of no self, and there's more than one, is that what seems like an individual person or a self is really a conglomeration of all these different, like, essentially particles. It's like we're made up of atoms, and it's just sort of an arbitrary decision to divide the self from what is beyond the self. And it's constantly changing from one moment to the next. It's like a flame. It's like a candle flame. So the candle flame is a different flame from one moment to the next. There is no abiding essence that is persisting that you can call the self of that flame. That flame has no self because it's just these particles that happen to be sort of associated with each other. And there's no clear demarcation exactly where the flame starts and stops. And also it's just in a constant state of flux and just changing from one moment to the next. So that would be a more orthodox Theravadan explanation of no self. Getting to exist, exist has to almost be an undefined term. Sort of like in physics, they say that energy has to be an undefined term because eventually you have to get down to the rock bottom of sort of an axiomatic word that, you can't just keep arguing back from that. Sort of like in logic, at some point you have to start with a premise that isn't itself the conclusion of other premises. It's like you just have to start somewhere, and existence is pretty much like an undefined term. But my dictionary does say exist, which is an intransitive verb, to have objective reality or being. So in that case, the whole objective thing kind of throws a monkey wrench into the works because objective is kind of illusory. There is nothing purely objective. There's always subjective mixed with objective. So to exist is to have objective reality or being. And if you're kind of dealing with a quasi-virtual reality, like all the infinite number of statues that exist in an uncarved block of stone, if you're dealing at the level of form, it's just not there. You could argue that there's the underlying essence of stone, but the statues that are contained in that stone, then there really are in there. But it takes some kind of imagination to actually sort of create a discrete statue inside that uncarved block of stone. So does the statue, the uncarved statue in the uncarved block of stone, and does that have objective reality or being? And you could argue that it doesn't. It has just sort of potential conditional reality or being, but it doesn't really have objective reality or being. And this entire phenomenal world, from some Buddhist points of view anyway, is just like that. And it's difficult to wrap your head around it, and it's better just to kind of grok it, not trying to be intellectual about it, just sort of, it's you're better off not even really believing it, because by believing it, you're just clinging to another belief, which isn't just another samsaric phenomenon. So you just kind of let go, you kind of adopt the classical skeptical view of suspending judgment, and then you get ataraxia, or peace of mind, through not clinging to ideas and coming up with conflicts and that sort of thing. So it's hard to explain, and I can explain it hundreds of times, or at least dozens of times, and I'll have to keep explaining it because it's not an easy concept to figure out. In fact, ultimately, it's impossible to figure out, because if you think you figured it out, you really haven't. Because concepts and thoughts cannot contain reality. I mean, they cannot grasp reality. I think it's the Diamond Cutter Sutra that says, the past mind cannot be grasped, future mind cannot be grasped, present mind cannot be grasped. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Philalethes, and he's the last questioner. These are the last questions from Philalethes. It catches me by surprise every time. We didn't have a huge list. I think it was like 30 questions. So we're a little over 2 hours. It'll be way less than 3 hours this time, unless I just go on this digression jag that'll just blow you all away. So anyways, Philalethes says, recently I've been reading about more esoteric forms of Buddhism, Mahayana of course, and it's been blowing my mind, especially Huayan and Shingon. The first of which is based on the 1600-page Flower Garland Sutra. Would love to hear your thoughts on these. And there's not really much I can say, because I think I read one book when I was a monk in Burma by some Huayan master. I don't remember his name. And it wasn't anything mind-blowing. It was pretty basic stuff, basic Mahayana. There was, a lot of it was just pretty much in agreement with Theravada. I mean, it's just like basic ethics and so forth. So, I mean, there wasn't anything really esoteric in that book. And that's the only book by anybody Huayan that I know of that I can remember. Shingon, I think that's like a Pure Land sect, isn't it? Yeah, I could be mistaken. I don't even know exactly what Shingon is. I really don't have much interest in that kind of thing. And so I might have like a very superficial familiarity with some of it, but I've never really gotten deep into it, simply because I don't consider it to be what the Buddha taught. And especially when I was a monk, I mean, I became a Buddhist in order to follow what the Buddha taught. I did not become a Buddhist to follow some later tradition from some other country or whatever. Now, I became a Buddhist in order to try to follow what the enlightened founder taught as well as I could. So yeah, I mean, 1600 pages is kind of extreme for me anyway. I have read some books that long, I guess, but I think Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is like 1400 pages or something. I think War and Peace is like 1400 pages. I read that. But reading the Flower Garland Sutra, it's really not really on my list of priorities. So, I mean, there's really not much I can say about Huayan and Shingon. Esoteric forms of Buddhism. The most esoteric Buddhism I've read would be like some kinds of Tibetan Buddhism. Like the biography of Padmasambhava was pretty esoteric. Even the autobiography of Milarepa was had some esoteric stuff in it. I mean, he started off as a black magician, for example, although he wasn't really a Buddhist yet. So, yeah, I really don't have a lot of thoughts on it, so I really can't say very much. So I'm going to move on to Philalethes' next question, which is, do you have any experience with esoteric Buddhism? And I mean, just reading a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism, that would be an experience with esoteric Buddhism. And also just having some casual, superficial contact with Burmese Theravadan esoteric Buddhism. Like you've got magicians, like wizards. I met this one Sayadaw who had a reputation for being a necromancer, like subjecting ghosts to his will, that kind of a thing. There are alchemist monks, quite a few alchemist monks in Burma who, I mean, that's kind of esoteric, and they got a lot of secret stuff. If they figure out a way how to transmute base metal into gold, that's going to be esoteric, because they don't want to share it with everybody, because then gold, the price of gold would plummet. So yeah, just casual, superficial experiences with mainly Burmese Theravada esoteric Buddhism, which isn't really orthodox Theravada, but it it was more or less orthodox Theravada Buddhist Sayadaw who had this reputation for being a necromancer. And a lot of the magic stuff is based on Theravada, like the wizardry. You've got white wizards and black wizards in Burma. The white wizards are devout Buddhist wizards, whereas the black wizards, they're more into like witchcraft and stuff and necromancy, that kind of thing. So I do have just very little experience, not enough really to say very much about it. So I'm just going to move on to Philalethi's third and last question, and the very last question of this Q&A. And that is, do you think a Buddhist sci-fi novel, or rather fantasy since scientific realism is a no-no, incorporating these sects would be cool? I ask because this is kind of what the last chapter, which is 350 pages of the Flower Garland Sutra is. Yeah, it depends on like the talent and imagination of the author, I suppose. I think there probably have been like esoteric Buddhist novels. And my friend Otto Excelsior was telling me about there's some kind of Buddhist novel. It's a science fiction novel that has like a Mahayana Buddhist theme to it. I mean, even The Catcher in the Rye has a Buddhist theme to it, which I didn't even realize when I first read it. It was like after reading the unofficial sequel, J.D. Salinger's unofficial sequel to The Catcher in the Rye, which is Franny and Zooey, finally dawned on me, man, this is Buddhism. But it wasn't esoteric Buddhism. It was kind of more Mahayana than Theravada, but it was sort of mainstream, like secular, almost secular Mahayana. So, yeah, I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't have a Buddhist science fiction or fantasy novel based on esoteric Buddhism. I don't see why not. It would depend on the talent, the writing skills and the imagination of the author that would determine whether it was successful or not. And I mean, there's ways of camouflaging even the Buddhist aspects of it. You could just have it not obviously Buddhist at all. Like The Matrix, it's got a lot of like esoteric Christianity in there that, I mean, most people, they don't see it at all. Most people can watch a very symbolic movie or read a very symbolic book and just not see the symbolism at all. Like William Golding's Lord of the Flies, the novel. I mean, the whole novel is a parable. It's everything in that novel is symbolic. And you can have intelligent, college-educated people read that novel and they just think it's about little boys on an island. They don't realize that the entire thing is like an apocalyptic parable. But yeah, I mean, sure, there's no reason at all why you couldn't have a Buddhist novel that's based on esoteric Buddhism. That, I mean, it could be overt or covert. I mean, you could just camouflage the Buddhism, or you could just have it on the surface. You can have some planet, colonized planet 2,000 years from now that somehow got converted over to esoteric Buddhism, and they're taking it seriously, and then you can just work out the ramifications of that, or the author could work out the ramifications of that. So yeah, I don't see that there's a problem with it. Although, as I say, I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about esoteric Buddhism other than what little I've already mentioned. And so that's it. We done. And so, as I should always say at the beginning, but almost always don't remember to say it until the end, if you got any questions you think I can answer, especially about Buddhist philosophies, particularly Theravada, like Burmese Theravada, I'm somewhat of an authority on. Early Buddhism, like the evolution of Buddhism, meditation, just Burma in general, me in general, like religion in general, philosophy in general, there is a good chance that I will be able to have some kind of intelligent answer, although there's no guarantee. And the farther away you get from the stuff that I've personally experienced, the less likely it is that I'll be able to really give a satisfactory answer. But I do my best. And with that, I'll just say, be happy.